and the names behind that effort. So pull up a chair, grab some coffee, and stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to this week's episode of Main Street. It is a beautiful Saturday morning here in San Diego, and we are going to dive right in. So, quick recap of last week, then we'll get into further developments. Then we have an interview with our favorite Luis Cornelio, and he is going to be speaking with us about the particular cabinet members in the Biden administration that are behind the current push and issues that we are discussing today. And then we'll wrap it all up in the end with some great content that I will bring up for you in just a bit. So, to get started, last week we talked about the push for the one-party system. We talked about how Biden's policies don't seem to make sense in and of themselves because they're poor policies across the board that are not having good fruit. They're not being effective, whether it's the border, whether it's vaccine passports, etc. A lot of these different policies have competing rhetoric and a lot of confusion around them, and they don't seem to make sense. But when you take a step back and you look at it from the big picture, what you see is that all of them, when in concert together, move toward creating a one-party system and centralizing power within the current administration and the centralized federal government. So, first point of that being the border crisis. With the border crisis, we've talked about the humanitarian concern that this is, with children getting separated from families, with trafficking, with rape, with all of the health concerns of those who are trying to cross the border. We talked about the health crisis with the high COVID rates, the inappropriate processing centers, because we're not able to process this quantity of people. And we've also talked about how this is a stress on the U.S. infrastructure, how it's a stress on our government systems, how we don't have the provisions and structures in place to be able to process and integrate this many people into our society. Two further developments as this is an ongoing crisis. The first is that Fauci has said he does not have time to deal with the border crisis, yet he keeps talking about all of these different issues with COVID, all of his concerns with COVID, and yet we're seeing one of the potentially greatest super spreader events taking place at the border right now, even across the street from where we are located. And over 10% of these migrants are testing positive for COVID and are not being able to be processed or quarantined or given the proper medical, social distancing space needs, etc. So we see this growing concern, and we see this lack of addressing that concern. Another development, and you'll see the photo here, is that there are reports of bus loads of migrants being transported into the interior of the United States. And so what this means is families of migrants, or those that claim to be a family unit, migrants with children, are being bused into the interior with different states. There are reports of Michigan and Pennsylvania and Florida. What I find interesting about each of these states is the essential nature that they are, or the essential element that they would be in providing security for future elections. So Michigan, obviously a swing state. Pennsylvania, obviously a swing state. These states have been in a lot of contention from the 2020 presidential election. And again, migrants are historically noted as voting Democrat. So there's been an opening of the border, creating humanitarian crisis, creating health crisis, creating stress on the U.S. system that we do not know the ramifications of yet. And now there is this busing that is taking place into the interior of the United States, and it's largely not being reported at this point. As you can see from the picture, it is taking place. So you can check out other news sources on that as well. The second component we talked about last week is the vaccine passports. The danger of this when it comes to the public-private partnerships and the sharing of personal information in order to track individuals and possibly use it for a political agenda, as well as the control element that this is invading into an interior place of U.S. citizens' lives that the government is not welcomed into. The government does not have authority to go into, and so the concerns with that. And then the third element that we touched on last week is the election system and the issue of election integrity, which of course is complete taboo. However, we had the privilege of interviewing my father, former Kansas Attorney General Phil Kline, and looked at H.R. 1, the danger of H.R. 1, and how it essentially codifies a one-party system through the way that it through the way that it implements and administers elections. So a couple highlights of that is that it removes the power from the state governments and puts it completely in Congress, using the power of finance in order to reallocate those powers in a manner contrary to the Constitution. That it codifies and solidifies a lot of the irregularities we saw during COVID-19, removing the need for voter ID, having same-day voter registration, a number of these elements that make the election system not only more susceptible to fraud, but where it removes the ability to track and trace irregularities within the system. So a prime example of this would be all of the migrants coming over the border would be able to vote, because we would have no way of tracking or identifying U.S. citizens versus non-U.S. citizens who are voting in our election system. And again, I do want to reiterate that it's not just families in need that are crossing the border, but that the border is being exploited by terrorists, by the cartel, and we are seeing this, and we are seeing reports of this currently. So with these three elements together, we have an influx at the border that's creating stress on the U.S. system, and an influx of a population that is most likely to support the current administration, because they are saying they are coming because of the current administration, because they know that the border is open. We are seeing the talk of vaccine passports that would get into personal information. It would be able to provide discrimination as far as who is able to engage in certain spheres of society and social activities and who is not, based on your vaccinated status and how that is perceived by the government, the public, and portrayed by the media. And then we're seeing the election system that is being radically altered in order to accommodate illegal migrants, as well as voter fraud irregularities, and to move the power that was originally vested in the states and the people according to the Constitution into the centralized federal government, specifically into Congress, in order to centralize that power even further. So that's a brief recap of last week. However, those aren't the only elements that are being employed in order to alter our system of government and to centralize power and to reinforce this one-party system moving forward. There are so many more, and again, we're not going to be able to even cover them all today, but I want to build on those three and look at three more. The first of those being the infrastructure bill, second, the Green New Deal, and third, the intentional escalation in the racial divide. So we're going to touch on these three things, and then we're going to move over to an interview with Luis, where we're going to talk about the cabinet members behind these particular policy pushes and why that is significant to us and how we can engage with that. I personally am not someone who thinks about cabinet members all the time. It's just, there are so many different aspects of government. I mean, in the day-to-day, it can be a lot to keep track of who's my governor, who's my senator, who's my representative. And then, we have local governance. And then when you're looking at the executive, you don't even really think about the cabinet members. But we are going to dive into that. And we're going to dive into why that is particularly significant with this current administration. So first, grab a sip. The infrastructure bill. I would like to actually pull up a quote from our former president, President Trump, mostly because of one particular word that he says in this quote. So this is Trump's comment, or one of his comments on the current infrastructure bill. And for those who don't know, the infrastructure bill, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about roads and bridges and things of that nature. The current infrastructure bill includes a lot more than that. However, there is a bill that is being brought forward that is dealing with these types of necessities. However, the manner in which it proposes dealing with these infrastructural improvements, as well as what it defines as infrastructure, alters the role of the federal government when it comes to being involved in these issues in a way that creates overreach. So here's President Trump's quote on this. If this monstrosity is allowed to pass, the result will be more Americans out of work, more families shattered, more factories abandoned, more industries wrecked, and more main streets boarded up and closed down, just like it was before I took over the presidency 4 years ago. And then he also adds that this plan will implement the largest tax hike in American history. So, obviously I chose that quote because of Main Street. But the name Main Street for this show was largely chosen because I live in a downtown area. There, the streets around here were thriving at the beginning of 2020. And now all the businesses on this block, except for one restaurant, have closed. Another one across the street has closed. And you can walk down and you see literally the boarded up businesses in this previously thriving downtown area. And so we're looking at an infrastructure bill and the Green New Deal, as well as a minimum wage increase right on the tail, fuzz in the air, right on the tail of COVID. So the infrastructure bill has a tremendous tax hike, and it's a tremendous tax hike on U.S. corporations, which is kind of a funny topic. I mean, especially if we're looking at AOC and her hatred of corporations, as well as the involvement of corporations in the 2020 election. However, just on a very simple, moving that partisan aspect aside, when you look at taxing corporations to such an extreme extent that it becomes fiscally more viable for them to move to China, to move their headquarters, to pay for labor in China, and that would decrease their tax burden in the U.S., that creates a problem because businesses will move. And so what we're seeing with this infrastructure bill that's being brought forth under the Biden administration, which has been very soft on China, very friendly with China in a number of ways, is that the bill essentially incentivizes the movement and the push towards shifting businesses to China and bankrupting businesses in the U.S. And so it's saying it's going to tax those businesses in order to enable this infrastructure plan, but in reality, those businesses will likely very much move, or they will be bankrupted in the process. Another aspect of the infrastructure plan, and my father touched on this last week, is that the way that it moves forward is it takes money from corporations and then it funnels it through government in order to come to ends or goals set forth by the government. So an example of this is broadband. There's an element of the bill that talks about expanding infrastructural aspects around broadband and internet, 5G, etc. And yet we already see a push for this in the private sector. So 5G has come or is coming to to many areas because of private competition. However, what this bill does is it says we're going to scrape off this huge margin from corporations. We're going to bring it into government. Then we're going to create this huge margin from corporations. We're going to bring it into government. Then we're going to create contracts with companies that we like. And we're going to push out this infrastructure bill. And we're going to bring this to people through this longer, more bureaucratic governmental system rather than allowing the free market to do what it's already doing. First, this just creates more government regulation. So the government is infused in more areas of everybody's lives. It creates dependency of those corporations on the government. So remember, socialism is when the government owns the means of production. This is moving towards that, where the government is saying, we have a stake in your company, we have more finances out of your company, and we control and dictate the direction of these contracts and the way things are going to be produced and improved. Third, it's inefficient. It's absolutely inefficient. Who likes going to the DMV? The DMV is awful. It takes forever. There are so many, hoops to jump through. That is a government-run system. Do we really want our internet, our, all of these, our healthcare, all of these things to be included in that? I would advocate not. I am actually very impressed when I scroll through my Instagram feed to see all of the innovative products and ideas that people are coming up with that are environmentally safe, or, aesthetic, or have some kind of purpose or value behind it, that are driving forward movement in the direction that we would like to go. The free market allows for that ingenuity and that engagement. A lot of those businesses, a lot of those ideas would simply not be there if we continue to move in this more socialist type direction. And then another aspect of the infrastructure bill is that many Democrats are claiming that infrastructure, roads and trains and bridges, also includes healthcare, also includes daycare, includes these other elements of our lives. And what does that do? It again allows the government to come in and to dictate what those things should look like. So an example would be insurance. When insurance companies dictate the way that a doctor is to provide care. I personally had a work comp injury. I ended up getting knee surgery, and the reason I got knee surgery is because they didn't address the issue in time. I probably shouldn't have ever had surgery, and yet I went from a person that ran 4 to 8 miles a day to someone who can hardly run at all, simply because I didn't get the proper care I needed because it was run through a bureaucratic governmental system. And that's talking about work comp. And if we want to escalate that to a larger healthcare and daycare, where they're determining things around our kids and our lives, this puts government in every single facet. And that is what the left wants. The far left wants control, and they want power. And we see this again in the Green New Deal, which is point number 2. The Green New Deal, coming forward largely from AOC. I believe it's co-authored by our vice president. Wow, my mind just went totally blank. Kamala Harris, our vice president, Kamala Harris. And with the Green New Deal, it's largely modeled after Obama's stimulus. So Obama put forward a stimulus while he was in office, but he included a lot of green material as far as moving towards a cleaner energy system and energy source. I personally have no issue with electric cars. I just don't think electric cars are feasible, without other energy sources at this current point in time. How do you make the electric cars? I believe Forbes brought this up in an article where they were saying, look, electric cars are great, but what are the resources that are required in order to build them? Well, you have to have coal. You have to have these other energy sources in order to transport parts, in order to, melt metals and form molds, etc. So it's just not, there are so many different elements in which these energy resources, these unclean energy resources are infused in our lives that we don't even think about. From textiles to automobiles to building infrastructure, to building houses and businesses, etc. So the unfeasible element. Another aspect that the Forbes article brought up is that health. So this is something that I wouldn't have thought of off the surface, but just looking at the Green New Deal. However, when you look at and you compare societies where people are healthier and they live longer, they all use crude oil. They all use coal. There is a high-level energy source that works well, that is efficient, that is reliable, as opposed to, say, solar, which is sporadic. Wind and hydro, which is sporadic. These are not reliable at all points in time. And so when you don't have reliable energy sources, you don't have reliable healthcare. You don't have reliable things that we use and we need in our daily lives. And so because of that, we see that health element. The next component of the Green New Deal, again, very similar to the infrastructure bill, is that it is wrought with regulations that will reach into every aspect of our daily lives, and it gives government more authority and more power. The U.S. government, the centralized U.S. government, was not originally created with the intent of regulating our daily lives. It was more so to protect us, to protect us from foreign enemies. And there were a couple other, elements that were in its original intent as well. But the infrastructure bill and the Green New Deal essentially rewrite the role of government and say, no, we are here to keep you safe. We are here to regulate every element of your daily life and make sure all your needs are met. But in so doing, we're going to take all your information, we're going to take your privacy, we're going to take your autonomy and freedom of choice, we're going to take your money in order to make this happen. And then you centralize all of that, and then there's the question of, okay, when all of that power, when all of that resource, when all of that information is centralized in one place, we see consistently in history what happens. And it is not for the good or the benefit of the people. And ultimately, it removes freedom. It removes freedom. So, again, freedom is an abstract term, but it's a very concrete aspect of our daily lives, especially as Americans. Freedom to speak, freedom to make decisions, freedom to purchase various things because of our free market system. We have so many choices, so many opportunities, and we get to engage with that because we have protected inerrant freedoms in this country. Third element, before we move over to our interview with Luis, super excited about, is the escalating racial divide. And this is tragic, and this is a topic worthy of a documentary series. And I'm going to address it here in the next couple minutes, which does not do justice. But it needs to be acknowledged in the current landscape as there is this push through policy to create a one-party system. What is taking a place alongside that is the social pressure to create division for an in-group and an out-group so that they can, again, push towards this perceived general will coming from a Jacques Rousseau type ideology in order to centralize power. And this has been taken by Marx, we see this throughout history where there is this need to create fragmentation and division in order to centralize power and authority in the name of protection, so that there's that element of control. And the way this is happening right now is through the escalation of racial divide. The trials are going on right now around George Floyd's death. There are numerous things that are taking place, and we will next week dive into critical race theory. We're going to take this head on and deal with some of these issues and talk about the hard stuff. But a couple things that I want to highlight here before we cut over to the next segment. The recent shootings. So saying that this was a racially motivated shooting when it came to the massage parlors. I talked about this previously. The suspect in custody says, no, it was not, that he had a sex addiction and he felt out of control. And so he shot up the massage parlors. Tragic, absolutely tragic, but not racially, or does not appear to be racially motivated. The shooting in Colorado, where, people are coming out saying this was a hateful white man, when the shooter was not actually a white man, and they weren't called out on their crap. Where were the fact checkers then? The Facebook fact checkers, they weren't there. So we're seeing this push towards the white man is perpetuating this crime against minorities, and now we're seeing the rise of actually a book in Target that has a prayer, help me to hate white people. And this is a book that is currently sold in Target. But what I want to address right now is actually the school system and the push to brainwash children and to teach them this critical race theory crap that is not about healing, that is not about reconciliation, that does not provide value or pride or dignity to the minority child, but instead just creates division and hurt and pain among children of all races and covers them with shame. So here is an abbreviated version of a video right now.
My daughter brought up and says, I don't understand this. And we noticed that it was not ancient history and world geography that she was learning. It was a race-related cartoon about a white character and a black character, and they had thought bubbles above their head with mitigating factors and risk factors. And, they were labeling police officers as a risk to people, and we didn't like that.
The main thing that caught my eye was the risk factor of the police officer. I come from a family of police officers. My sister-in-law's father was killed in the line of duty, and I firmly believe that everyone should respect them. That was the main thing that did stick out to me, and that's when I had emailed the teacher and asked to have a conversation with her to find out what was going on in this class.
She was teaching the course, so she had a little emoji of herself, and she had a Black Lives Matter shirt on.
I just didn't know what it meant, had anything to do with history or world geography. We would have worked with her, and that's what we were looking, but she had no answers for us.
And the superintendent, he called us in for a meeting. So I thought we were getting saved. I said, great, and everything's gonna work out. And it was the complete opposite of what I thought. We went in and he just sat across the desk and he wanted to hear what Ann and our thoughts were, and he completely disagreed with all of our thoughts. So we talked a little bit more about, some decisions, and I said to him, I said that every relationship in the world is based on compromise. And I said, this is what we're asking. I said, remove the BLM emoji, right? And that shouldn't be in the classroom. So he turned around and said, good luck finding a school for your children. We're wondering, what does this have to do with ancient history and world geography?
It was just an outrage that somebody who simply wanted to know what his curriculum was for his young daughter was fired from his job.
Not only did they fire him, but they told him in the town that he was being fired because he exercised his First Amendment rights.
You feel helpless. There's nothing you can do about it.
Cancel culture on steroids down here in Dedham. It's just unbelievable what they're doing to this man and his family.
So as you can see, this leftist ideology is being perpetuated and fed to children in our school system. It's becoming normalized, desensitized, but it's creating pain. This is an absolute tragedy. So we're going to go over to, again, next week we're going to really tackle this in full, but the reason I wanted to address the racial escalation as part of the push towards the one-party system is there has to be fragmentation and division and disunity in order for a centralized power grab of control. And we're seeing those taking place simultaneously, and we have seen this in history. So we're going to go over to Luis right now, and we are going to talk about the persons behind all this. who's behind it, who's in the Biden administration, check out this interview that I had with Luis Cornelio. As promised, I am here with Luis Cornelio, an editor for El American, and we have worked with him on various projects, and he is here today. We're jumping right in to who are the people behind this? What's going on in the Biden administration? We've talked about the one-party push. We've talked about the Green New Deal. We've talked about the infrastructure bill. So Luis, who's behind this? What's the effort? What is going on here?
Thank you for having me, Jacqueline. I think it's quite clear that the Biden administration is now the party of socialism and the party of the left. President Biden made it clear during the campaign trail that he was a candidate of the progressive movement. He made that clear when he selected Kamala Harris as his vice president. Kamala Harris is the co-author and co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. She was a supporter of Medicare for All, which in other words is a complete takeover from government of a private industry. President Biden has also made it clear by selecting a handful of individuals who are pretty sketchy and, support ideologies that, suppress dissent. And, you have Anthony Blinken, for example, who spent most of his time criticizing President Trump and the Trump administration in terms of foreign policy. I wrote an article for El American detailing the Biden foreign policy and how it's a continuation of the Obama administration just on steroids. Anthony Blinken, it's like unable to take blame for or, be responsible for some of the atrocities of the Obama Biden administration. And now we have a Secretary of State who blames everything on President Trump, and that's pretty shameful. You also have, the Attorney General, who it's actually, known to be a bipartisan person. However, what I tell people often is that the people who are working underneath the secretaries, it's what actually matters. There's a lot of rumors that President Biden is not actually in charge, that it's his actual cabinet and his vice president. And I agree with that notion. You also have Vanita Gupta, who was recently nominated to be the Associate Attorney General. And Gupta has a very shady record in terms of, calling on Facebook to ban elected officials. She has a record of calling on big tech to ban, hate speech. And, I had the privilege of writing an op-ed for GAD Freedom, and it's up on gad-freedom.org, where I detail, the Democrats' definition of hate speech. To them, any conservative speech is considered hate speech. And, like I tell people, take a look at who's actually running the country. President Biden, tried to portray himself as the bipartisan candidate.
Come on, man. Just,
Come on,
come on, man. Super reasonable. Can't we just all get along? Just wear a mask.
Right. Just wear a mask. Just let me, the government, control your life and limit your freedoms. He tried to portray himself as the bipartisan candidate. And the truth is, his cabinet and his record as president shows the complete opposite.
I think a lot of the time we as Americans don't think about the cabinet because, for one, we're a federalist system, so we have so many different jurisdictions within government, from, the local level to the federal level and then the various branches. So you add the cabinet, and there isn't a lot of thought about that, except who a person surrounds themselves with is one of the most key indicators of their character and their intent. So one of the themes that you touched on and that you brought up, and I've been seeing consistently as I've been looking into this, is the prominence of Obama activists who are being raised up. It's almost like they were groomed in the Obama administration and they're being given the pass the torch or given the authority in the Biden administration. Can you speak to that a little more?
Yeah, so I'll tell you this, people often try to compare the Biden administration with the Obama administration. Like I told you earlier, this is the Obama administration on steroids.
Right.
So, if people try to argue that, this is like Obama, this is like a third term of the Obama administration, I think people are wrong. This is a new movement. This is a new, radical leftist, movement of an administration, and primarily what they're trying to do is to suppress, opposing views, oppress and suppress conservative thought, and in ways that this country has not seen in our history. And that's quite problematic. you know Prager, the CEO of Prager U, did an interview with an American where she said, if we lose the US, where are we going to go? She said that she has people from.
I've had interviews with people, and consistently immigrants say that exact same language.
Yeah, and she said that she get messages from people from Venezuela telling her, "Hey, like, what are you guys doing in the U.S.? We're trying to flee socialism, and it's quite, ludicrous to see elected officials, namely people in the Biden administration, push for ideologies that pretty much are very similar to socialism, and a complete government takeover of private industries." And like I tell people, if we let this administration get away with you know this big government suppressing dissent, where are we going to go? And I came to this country from the Dominican Republic, and I grew up with people from Cuba who actually fled Marxist ideologies because the way of living in that country, it's so poor. The DR is not a very wealthy country. So when you have people fleeing other countries to come into the DR, which economy is not super great, you have a problem. And this Biden administration, it's pretty much like a radical version of the Obama administration, and people should be concerned.
Kind of left wing question for you. How does AOC fit into this? Does she fit into this, or is she just rogue on her own?
Well, look, American recently published an article that we're describing a survey that by a nonpartisan organization that labeled AOC as one of the least efficient Congress members.
I did see that.
And, like I tell people, and I tweeted about this, this is a great disservice to the people of the Bronx and Queens, New York City. When she first got elected, she talked about, bringing change to Washington, D.C., and bringing results to the people of New York City. So my question to her is, you have been in power for 3 years. What legislation have you passed? What benefits have you brought to the people of New York City? Zero. Last year, I think she introduced a number of 21 legislations. That's it. She just introduced the legislation. And I was watching a segment in Fox News, and I actually partially agree with their commentary. And the idea was that AOC might not be an efficient Congress member in terms of like passing legislation. However, she is a powerful and influence in terms of messaging and promoting radical ideas. And I partially agree with that assessment because, everyone knows AOC. She has
Right.
passed zero legislation, but she has been able to persuade, the Biden administration into more to the left. And she has the support of the, young Americans who, might not be aware of the dangers of socialism. But, I'm grateful that we have a handful of American patriots who are able to know and realize, that the benefits of these radical ideologies are zero, nada.
Luis, who are the key cabinet members? Sorry, shifting back to the cabinet, but who are the key cabinet members that viewers, Americans should keep their eyes on?
Yeah, so there's a handful of them. You have Javier Becerra, who used to be the Attorney General of the state of California. Javier Becerra, is a radical politician who actually sued nuns in an attempt to force them to provide, contraceptives to
That's
women.
such an odd. That's very odd.
It's super odd. And and it's like, where is the the religious freedom? Where is the respecting people's beliefs, especially religious beliefs? This is someone who's the Supreme Court recently ruled that his defense of that law was unconstitutional because you cannot force, um, you know, religious institutions to provide contraceptives to women. His defense of that California's ban on indoor worship was recently ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Now this is a person who doesn't have any medical experience, yet he's heading the HHS. And if he was able to support some of these radical ideologies in California, just imagine the type of government control that he's willing to support in HHS. You also have HUD Secretary Marsha Fudge, who, as a congresswoman, supported HR 1, which is a complete federalization of our state elections. She also supported HR 4, which pretty much abolishes state voter ID laws. And these are just laws, common sense laws. And Sean Hannity recently had a segment, detailing, what type of services you need and what type of IDs you need to get, from getting into an airplane, from getting welfare to applying for housing, to visit the White House and to visit the Capitol Hill. You need an ID. And I think that segment it's quite interesting, and I pledge people to go and see that. You also have.
And Luis, we've got time for one more here, and then we've got to wrap up the segment, but we're going to come back because I want to talk to you about Second Amendment, and I want to talk to you about whether these cabinet members are qualified, because there are a number of them that don't seem to fit the job that they're in, but they have other qualifiers that might line up more with a United Airlines pilot, let's say. So one more cabinet member, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
And you also have Pete Buttigieg. He's what used to be the mayor of South Bend in Indiana. And, this is someone who doesn't have any experience in infrastructure. And, recently the Biden plan on infrastructure includes a bunch of stuff that is not related to our roads and airports. Senator Gillibrand, for example, said that healthcare and childcare is infrastructure. And, we see Pete Buttigieg supporting those type of ideologies. So I pledge people to take a look at the people who are actually controlling this administration and keep an eye out for their radical policies.
Right. And the danger with that, of course, being that if we start redefining what is infrastructure, they can push through an agenda that isn't related to infrastructure at all. So absolutely ridiculous, absolute insanity. I appreciate you bringing all this information and joining us today, and we'll definitely have you back because I have more questions for you that I want to ask, but we've run out of time in the segment. So thanks, Luis.
Thank you for having me, Jacqueline.
Special thanks to Luis Cornelio for giving us fresh perspective and giving us insight into the particular members of the Biden administration and their viewpoints and what they are bringing forward. I do have my co-host with me now, which is why I'm squirming just a little bit. As you can see, he has pretty much doubled in size from last week, so he's growing fast and soon will no longer be on my lap. We'll see if he continues his co-hosting duties or not. But for this last section, which you want to stay for, we're going to briefly overview the international aspect of what's taking place. Just highlight a couple things. This is not an international news segment. It's just to draw emphasis to a pattern that's taking place internationally. And then we're going to talk about us. How do we engage with these issues? How do we address them? Because otherwise we're just stuck. And otherwise we're just stuck, and we're stuck as victims in the mix and in the mess. So in Australia, there is a video clip that I'm not going to be able to show. It's a little bit longer clip of a mother being arrested, a pregnant mother being arrested in her home moments before she's supposed to leave to go to the doctor for an ultrasound because of a Facebook post. And based on the video, my understanding is that the Facebook post was to hold a peaceful protest about the lockdowns. And she was arrested within her home. another video here, and I am going to show this one. We'll have the link for the other up on the channel. But is a Good Friday service being interrupted in the UK for not following COVID regulations and threats of fining or jail. So take a quick look at this.
Ladies and gentlemen, this gathering is unfortunately unlawful under the coronavirus regulations we have currently. You are not allowed to meet inside with this many people under law. At this moment in time, you need to go home. Failure to comply with this direction to leave and go to your home address ultimately could lead you to be fined £200, or if you fail to give your details, to you being arrested. I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, though it is Good Friday and I appreciate you would like to worship, that this gathering is unlawful, so please may you leave the building now.
I don't show these because we're looking at going international in our news coverage or anything of that nature, but again, to show that the overwhelm is real, that the pattern of government overreach, that government encroachment in everyday lives is becoming excessive. And there is a common theme, there's a common narrative that's taking place. And so the overwhelm that we can feel as citizens is very real. How do I engage this? What do I do about it? How do I navigate daily life when something that used to be abstract and distant is now touching every aspect of what I do, even to the point of making identity claims about my value as a person based on a particular political affiliation, belief system, identity, or preference. And so as we look at this, there is one more aspect of that overwhelm I want to reference. I'm going to pull up my phone here in order to reference a book, The Betrayal Bond by Patrick Carnes. And in the introduction, essentially in this book, he's talking about the way that we bond with one another, trauma bonding, things of that nature. But he makes a particular reference to German children in the 1920s and 1930s. And he's referencing a book written by Alice Miller. And in the book, she talks about how these children were desensitized to trauma, to pain, and so they would disassociate, and how that made way for a leader that was charismatic and outgoing as Hitler, but they disassociated that from the grotesqueness of what he was bringing to their society. And so the author of this book goes on to say that if Miller is right, we are currently experiencing the kind of fear and acclimatization that made a Hitler possible. Now, that sounds rather extreme. I know there have been a lot of Hitler claims, oh, so-and-so's like Hitler, Trump's like Hitler, this person's like Hitler. I'm not saying anyone is like Hitler. What I am acknowledging is that our society is restructuring in such a way that we are desensitizing ourselves to the types of pain and trauma, as well as the systems of overreach that make that type of leadership, if you can even call it leadership, possible. And this is really overwhelming. This is very frightening. And so the question then becomes, well, what can I do? What can I do as an individual person? I'm just trying to live my life. Obviously, I'm trying to live my life. I have a puppy, grab a puppy, get emotionally stable, pet a dog. But so what do we do? The reason that I began to re-engage politics was the rise of BLM. And there's a specific story, a specific moment that I remember that I don't have the full time to go into to paint it all for you. But my husband and I, we had moved in with my sister-in-law. We were living in her basement temporarily. And my husband was called up. He's a member of the National Guard, and he was called up for the LA riots. And my husband is mixed race. My mother-in-law is part black, and my husband is as well. And so it was a time of a lot of confusion and frustration about what's taking place, what's going on. There are injustices that occur. How do we engage with those elements? And I remember sitting on my bed, the light was coming through the window, and there was this question of, how do I speak into this environment? Because if I say that racism is wrong, which it absolutely is, my voice and the energy behind it is going to be used as part of the momentum to fuel a movement that really has very little to do with racism and has far more to do with power and a political ideology. And if I was to speak out against BLM, the organization, then I would likely be perceived as a racist. When my closest friends in high school and college and my husband all come from mixed race or black families. So it's incongruent with my reality. But we've created this either or, this stigmatization that is extremely dangerous. And so I felt very deep inside, somewhere inside me, that if I didn't engage now, if I didn't find a way to articulate truth and engage with the culture to create dialogue, that we would lose something very fundamental that is absolutely necessary to a healthy human existence. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. I want to hear your thoughts on whether you feel able to engage, whether you feel empowered to engage, if you have an avenue or a platform through which you're able to engage. So go to my Facebook page right now, leave me a note, or DM me on Instagram. You can see the handles popping up on the screen. Let me know what your thoughts are on this. Do we still have the ability to engage in dialogue around issues rather than just stigmatizing persons and canceling things that make people uncomfortable? What's the solution? And are we able to engage with that? I want to show one clip here of Tucker Carlson talking about AOC. It's a little bit caustic, but I want your thoughts. So let's pull up the clip.
And deported their families and permanently traumatized these children. These things are barbaric and they're wrong. Those families are owed reparations, period.
Tucker, your thoughts?
It's just interesting to come to a place where a low IQ race baiter like that has an important voice in national policy. Like, who cares what she thinks? Like, she's totally reckless, and she's a racist, like, openly. I think the key to this, though, is to think clearly about what's best for the United States. Obviously, the border policy now is a disaster. To be fair, it's been a disaster for a long time. It doesn't serve the interests of most Americans. And it won't, because people like that use the magic word, which is racism, to cow the rest of the country into submission. But we're allowing her and people like her to do that because we're afraid of being called names. Until decent people, like, shed their fear of being smeared by someone whose opinion you really shouldn't care about, then we're never going to have a rational immigration policy that helps everybody. And one last thing, how does it help Ecuador or El Salvador or Guatemala or any of the countries from which these people are coming to have your most ambitious people leave? It's a disaster for them, too, and for us. It doesn't help any good person to have this kind of uncontrolled migration into our country. I don't care whatever that woman's name is thinks, and no one should care what she thinks.
So what are your thoughts on this clip? Do you think that people are truly afraid to speak out? And if so, why? Why are people afraid to engage? I know this clip can be a bit caustic, but I think Tucker Carlson has some really excellent points. And so I think I know we need to engage them. And I'm sorry for the distraction of this little guy. He has just woken up from his nap. Couple calls to action, a couple of last minute things before we go. Hope is not lost. We're seeing a pushback from the states, which, whether it comes to the mask mandates or issues around concealed carry and firearms as well as transgender and children in transgender studies. So we're seeing the states push back saying, no, we don't want some of these Biden administration policies in our states. That being said, because there's this diffusion of power, there is still hope to preserve individual freedoms, but it requires the tension of the pushback. So what's our role? We are now providing action points each week. We have links that you can go to if you follow our social media channels that will enable you to engage with your senator, your representative on specific issues, but you need to sign up. So I'm going to have the sign up link in social media, freeroots.com, freeroots.com. And when you sign up, they don't use any of your personal information elsewhere. They don't sell it. They don't use it for marketing purposes. What it does is it enables them to line you up with your local representatives when you take action points, so that it makes those action points easier and simpler for you. So go ahead and sign up. Again, that will be on our social media channels, and we will be providing action points through those social media channels, as well as a new website launch coming soon, through which you can engage on the issues that matter most to you. Along with that, corporate response. So a lot of corporations are, oh my goodness, very much tied to the far left agenda. I don't have time to pull up the website and scroll through, but boycotts are effective. We have seen many people taken down on Twitter, and then their following responds and says, hey, why are they not here? We want them here. Twitter says it was an accident, and they are reinstated. So making your voice heard is very valuable, both from a corporate buyer standpoint, where things are happening financially. That's why we get to determine what's provided within a free market system rather than a government-run industry system, as well as making your voice heard to your local representatives. Lastly, volunteer locally. I am signing up as a poll worker. Sign up as a poll worker, sign up locally, and engage in your local government. Get involved in the way that you feel led and called to get involved, because America is your America as long as we continue to fight for it, and as long as we continue to dream into it. So thank you so much for joining me today on today's episode of Main Street, Your Street, and My Street. I am going to go catch up with that puppers and make sure that he is not tearing apart the house. So thank you for joining us. Much love. See you next week.